Here is the crankshaft out of that 1951 Royal Enfield 350 Bullet G2 model, and this is as it's just been removed from the engine. I haven't done anything with it yet. I literally got it out of the engine, had a look at it, wiped it down, and there's going to be some work needed on it, and I'll probably end up splitting it. One of the things is the timing side main shaft here. This portion of it runs direct in the bronze bush, and this portion runs direct in an open roller bearing, and unfortunately the surface of it has got rather pitted. You can actually see rusty imprints of the bearing rollers there, so hopefully the camera will pick that up. If not, you might have to just take my word for it. You can actually see the needle of the dial gauge flickering a little bit as it goes over the pits. So that's really going to have to be changed, unless I can come up with some sort of needle race with an inner race that will slip over that to maybe replace it. I'll look into all that anyway, but I think under the circumstances it's probably going to be a good idea, in view of everything else that's happened with this machine, to split the crank anyway and have a look at the big end, and possibly even consider getting a replacement for that conrod if we can. They're not so easy to come by as the later post 1955 Bullet conrods, because these are narrower, and well, they're not in stock at Hitchcock's at the moment, as I understand, although there's a very expensive alternative that you can get. But anyway, for now I just want to spin this crank between centres and see what we've got as it came out the engine. And we got quite a bit of run out clock in there. We got about 6/1000ths of an inch showing on that clock, and certainly good 5, possibly even 6/1000ths of an inch on that one. The needles are rising and falling together, so one does actually cancel the other out, and this crank would have probably spun quite smoothly inside the main bearings had they been in reasonable order, but they were in a terrible condition on the timing side, so they're all going to have to be replaced. I'll probably have to replace this timing side main shaft as well, which will mean splitting a crank, and while I'm in there I'll get a good look at the big end and the crank pin as well, and consider any options for the conrod if we can change it for something a little less battered and scarred. So that's the run out on this crank as it came out the engine. So I know that if I split it, if and when I put it back together, hopefully all sorted out, that I can aim for better than that if I can. But at least they're, like I say, they're rising and falling together, so that is nowhere near as bad as if they were going in opposite directions. So we'll see where we go with that. My next job, I think, is probably going to be to speak to the owner and then probably split this crank and see what we've got. More shock and amazement regarding the 1951 350 Royal Enfield Bullet G2 that I've been working on, and I'm now fully rebuilding. I've got the crank all in bits and everything, and I'm replacing the timing side main shaft with a new one. We've got a new big end floating bush. The crank pin is perfect, there's no wear on that at all, so I'm keeping that. And I've got a forged steel conrod now in place of that rather battered looking alloy one that we had in there before, which at some time in its life, not this time, but obviously suffered a worn big end and rubbed against one flywheel, causing that gouging there, so that wasn't great. This forged steel conrod came from, believe it or not, a scrap pre-war 350 Model C engine, which looked like it had just been dredged out of a canal after 50 years. It was in a terrible state, but I got the crank out of it, and although the big end had play in it, the conrod is good, but the big end outer race wasn't any good, so I took the good one from this conrod that was in the G2 already and pressed it into here. I've got a new floating bush to go in, so the big end's going to be good, and I'm waiting on, I put this new small end bush into the conrod, but I wasn't really happy with, I made it slightly too sloppy a fit for the gudgeon pin, and they're not terribly expensive, so I've got another one ordered. I'm going to put in and do that again. But I was going to put the crank together anyway with this conrod and the new floating bush and everything in, and get the flywheels together and true them up, and I'm still going to go for it. But what's amazing is I just thought I'd blast the compressed air through the oil hole there, where the oil comes from the timing side flywheel via the main shaft and through the crank pin and out through a couple of holes into the centre of the floating bush big end. And I put the airline in here and I couldn't feel anything blowing out of the two oil holes in the middle of the crank pin, where I could hear hissing. Well, the hissing was coming out of here. Well, check this out. There's supposed to be a threaded plug in there closing that end of the crank pin off. Otherwise, all or the vast majority of any oil pumped in will just come out of there, supposedly, rather than go into the big end. And that was like that all the time. I've only just spotted it, but the engine was running like that, and I've done about 100 miles on it, and the big end stayed good. We had lots of wet sumping, and thinking about it, that probably contributed to it as well. Certainly while the engine was running. But I'm going to obviously plug that off and we'll have it working properly. But I'm just amazed that the big end and everything else all survived with that missing entirely. So nearly everything that the oil pump was pumping into the engine would have just been coming out the side there. Okay, it would have been lubricating the piston and everything and getting flung around quite a lot, and pumped out and up to the rockers, etc. But there was probably nowhere near as much oil going to the big end as should have been. So this time around I'll be plugging that off, and then the lubrication system will be working as it really should. It just goes to show that big end had run anything but dry. It was in very good condition, and that plug in the end of the crank pin was totally missing. You learn something new and amazing every day, you really do. Right, here we are with the crank from the 1951 350 G2 Royal Enfield Bullet that I've been having lots of fun and games with. And I've now got the conrod that I want fitted with a new floating bush in the big end, as discussed already, and I've got the crank reassembled and all the lock nuts tightened up, and this is how it's going to be inside the engine. It's pretty similar to what it was like before when I spun it between centres before splitting it. Very slightly, perhaps marginally better, but not by much, but it is marginally better. It's not any worse. It's a little bit better than it was, as it was when it came out the engine. And we're clocking 0 to 5/1000ths of an inch on that clock, and 0 to 5/1000ths of an inch on that clock. Now, before I split the crank, I think we were going up to around 7 apiece at the same time. The good news is these two clocks are still moving at the same time as each other, and therefore the one cancels the other out, except instead of having 6 or 7 cancelling each other out, we've got 5 cancelling each other out. So in the grand scheme of things, I think that's got to be an improvement. The gauges are rising and falling together, and they're taking readings off the main bearing areas of the main shafts. So I think that we're going to be alright there. It's certainly marginally better than it was before, and the conrod is going to be much less of a worry. The timing side main shaft is now a brand new one. We're going to have new main bearings. I'm pretty confident that this is all going to work out fine, and the engine will run nice and smoothly, and also perhaps at last we'll be able to put the wet sumping issues to bed. And I'm also obviously going to fit a plug to blank the drilling off in the crank pin, as I discussed already. That's amazing that that thing ever worked like that without either seizing up or, well, it certainly wet sumped. There was plenty of oil obviously getting flung out of it, but I don't think that was responsible for the actual wet sumping when the engine was left idle. I think it was getting past a very worn timing side bush and main shaft, and there'll be all new components there, so that should be a thing of the past as well, all being well. So this one's ready to go back in the engine and on to the next phase of the rebuild.